Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules this morning as we dialogue about the ACRL framework for information literacy. We will begin shortly with a quick Zoom poll, but first, I would like to introduce you, my colleagues, to another one of my colleagues, Candace Jacobs. Candace Jacobs is an ECU library graduate student, and she works at North Carolina A&T as an administrative support specialist in the College of Health and Human Sciences. She created the beautiful infographic that you received, and she outlined this presentation today. She is a future and upcoming librarian extraordinaire, as evidenced by just being recognized by program faculty as a 2021 recipient of the Department of Interdisciplinary Professionals Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Graduate Student Scholarship. It has been my pleasure to work with her during COVID, at this time as a graduate assistant here in Bluford and a volunteer. I'd also like to give special thanks to A.D. Foster for his support in this presentation.
You're on mute. We can't hear you, A.D. Foster.
My apologies. Thank you, Joni. Thank you, Harvey. Since I only have 3 minutes, I just want to talk about, I guess, the evolution of information literacy and where we are now. And the evolution is really based upon the changing of the culture of not just higher ed, but the culture in general. So, you know, I guess back in 1999, 2000, there was a task force formed, ALA, ACRL. And they came up with the information literacy standards that most of us probably are well familiar with. And the reason why that came about was, you know, I guess the two components was just the rapidly changing of technology and the proliferation of information. You have to remember it was 2000, so, you know, the internet was probably 5-6 years old. Technology was booming, the .com was coming about, so there were a lot of things that came about. And over the past, I guess, you know, depending on how long you use it, 20 years, in regards to the standards, you know, I think the librarianship profession has done a lot with the standards. A lot of people have taught, created courses. We've come a long way in regards to showing the information literacy student, right? But I think, according to the literature, some of the issues with the standards, though, was that, you know, again, it was 15 years old. And so it was time for a change. But also, too, it focused on steps. So, you know, if you conquer step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, now you're information literate, you know. Not always the case, right? Not always the case. Not that easy. It's an easy way to assess, but it's just not that easy. You know, I know a lot of us like to be linear sometimes, but it doesn't always work, right? So with, you know, the culture change and it's time for a new era of standards and frameworks, and the steps just, you know, keeping you kind of structured. This is where the framework came about. You know, there was another task force the same task force that came in probably 2012. They wanted to revise it, right? And so they wanted to look at, you know, focus more on an ecosystem that just didn't focus on the student and the librarian or just librarianship. They wanted to focus on higher ed. They wanted to focus on professors in the disciplines, right? But also too, around that time, we wanted to broaden our concepts of digital literacy, information fluency, meta literacy. And so this is what the framework kind of entails, right? It wasn't just about the steps. They wanted to expand more about the process as being lifelong learners, right? And so this is where kind of the framework is. And then I'm just going to mention one more thing. Even though we're not going to talk about it right now, we'll talk about it probably in the fall when we get more in depth with it. But there's something new coming out, or it's kind of already out. A lot of librarians are using the framework, right? But they're including the DEI perspective in it. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so some individuals and librarians are having some issues with the framework because it doesn't exclude or it doesn't include the DEI concepts and perspectives. Which talks about, digital divide, algorithmic bias, recognition bias, a lot of those things that are in the culture right now, right? Racism, sexism, and things of that nature. And it looks at it more of a systematic approach. It looks at you individually too as looking at your own biases, but also from a systematic approach, barriers and suppression of those. So we went from the student, all right, focusing on student and the profession itself. Then we transitioned to more of a broad approach, not just steps, but more about the process and lifelong learners. And then kind of now where it's kind of moving to now is including in the framework, the DEI concepts. Okay, so thank you.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about just the beginning of the framework and basically its inception. So the framework began as an extension of the American Association of School Librarians, Task Force on Information Literacy Standards. And it emphasized information literacy as common to all disciplines, learning environments, and levels of education. And it also discussed its utilization in a variety of information types during a period of frequent technological advancement, such as one that we're in now. And its promotion of lifelong learning, its standards, performance indicators, and outcomes. And lastly, it was actually created as a response to the Boyer Commission report of 1998 as a means of improving undergraduate education. Next slide, please. So the information literacy competency standards of higher education were first published in 2000, and that helped to introduce information literacy to the field of library science. And later on, it was further developed, like the frameworks were further developed in 2014, with the final draft being released in June 17th of 2014. So what is information literacy? So it's the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning, such as what A.D. Foster talked about with the new approach.
Let's talk a little bit about the framework. Now, it's based on cluster course concepts, and there are 6. The ACRL continues to develop a toolkit that links information, research, and the support of scholarship through the framework. There are a set of learning outcomes, and it defines the enumeration of skills or things that the learner should accomplish. And it looks at development of curriculum. These concepts are called threshold concepts. Learning by making connections through theory and then applying them to practice. Threshold concepts also are specific to a discipline, but they also look at the big picture, meaning that you want to create effective learning modules, assignments, fill in the blanks, but you look at curricular design, and it can be discipline specific, but then how does it relate to the total frame of learning? How do we teach and how do learners learn? So let's look at how it's drawn up. Most of what started the framework was a Delphi study for concepts in information literacy. We have listed all of the links, so you're welcome to go and pull those to kind of look at those in preparation for our part 2 of this program. But we wanted to make sure that you had the information so that if you had additional questions, you could bring those to our attention. So for example, we want to look at the goals related to those different concepts. How do we practice the knowledge? How do we develop the curriculum? And then we describe in ways which to address effective, attitudinal, or valuing dimension of learning. So those are 2 areas that the framework was built upon. And so let's take a look at the frames. The past were standards. The future are the frames, assessing student progress towards information literacy and learning. So the first frame is authority is constructed and contextual. Research tools, credibility of resources. So for example, it lists, how do you define the types of authority? Are they by subject, by expertise, by position, office or title, or special experiences? There are different ways to learn. Information as a creation of a process. How do you deliver the information that you want your learners to seek? And we did send out a link for all of these, the dispositions and examples that you can use as we build the toolkit. So let me give you just a few examples. So when you use one of the hot topics that the frames design or talk about are metacognition. That's a hot topic now. Dr. Sandra McGuire is leading the way from LSU in the sciences about metacognition. If you've been able to attend any of the evaluative topics with Dr. Dentith, we know that metacognition teaches a different way of learning. We're getting away from rote. The frames define different ways of learning and different ways of developing curriculum with which to learn, meaning we're moving more towards active learning. How do you determine if what you're teaching is being learned and if it can be applied? So it's not just giving someone doing a presentation, explaining to them what you want them to know, and then testing them on the material. It's going beyond testing on the material and seeing how that student or that learner thinks about each of the frames. So, information creation as a process. For example, you want your learners to be able to articulate, assess, evaluate. So we're moving to the active terms, meaning that you're moving away from a true false example. But how do you get them to showcase that they understand what you have been trying to teach them? So you're getting sort of out of the box of instruction. Also, a good example of this for those of you who may or may not be aware is the QM rubric or the Quality Matters rubric. It adopts the knowledge practices such as this. So it's not enough to just teach. You have to move toward an active learning phase so that learners can showcase learning. Candace, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. So the third frame is information has value. And this means that information has a lot of dimensions of value that include commodity, a way of educating, influencing, and negotiating and understanding the world around you, as well as legal and socioeconomic matters that influence information production and distribution. And the fourth frame is research is inquiry. So this means that research is iterative, which I looked up and actually means it's something that happens frequently. And it relies on posing increasingly complex or new questions whose answers create more questions or lines of inquiry in any field. So basically ways of kind of expanding research and expanding knowledge of a particular field.
And the last two frames are scholarship as conversation. This one we're a little bit more knowledgeable about because of our scholarly communications. That's another key term that's coming through librarianship. And what it does, it helps learners develop their information literate abilities. It looks at things such as understanding how to cite work of others in your own information production. How do you contribute to scholarly conversation at the appropriate level, whether it's an online, whether it's group work, how do you identify barriers for scholarly conversation versus various venues? And so how do you look at contributions of others and determine how you would use that as far as creating a community of scholars or researchers or professionals that would move that scholarship forward? And then the last frame, searching as strategic exploration. We want to look at ways that learners develop their information literate abilities. So can we teach them or show them how to determine an initial scope of whatever task they've been giving or whatever curricula you've developed for them? And who should be a part of that conversation? Who are the scholars that should be involved? Can you identify those as a learner? Who are the organizations and other entities that should be involved when you're looking for that strategic exploration to prove that you can necessitate whatever the assessment of your information resource or whatever you're creating? And how do you define or refine needs or search strategies, which you would do as a scholar when you're writing? So that rounds out the frames. But yes, it is difficult sometimes to look from the standards to move to the frames, but ACRL has been very focused in creating the toolkit with which you can build a curricula to make sure that your student or your learner understands what it is you're trying to teach them and how you are assessing that they have taken control of the material that you're working with them and you want them to learn. And so as we move forward with ACRL, we, as AD said, there's another layer. And so how do you get your learner, your student, to understand that they have to layer in another area as well? And so we just keep moving forward with it. So for right now, we're going to have an activity, probably no more than 15 minutes or so. We were going to do a breakout rooms for all of the frames. And we thought, well, that might be a little bit too forward in that I still remember 50% of us have had some experience with the framework, but the other 50% have not. And so the activity that Candace is going to lead us through, if you could put this link in your browser and click on it, a box is going to come up to your left. And so what we would like to garner from you are ideas that you have on any of the frames of anything that you'd like to tell us about the framework. I want you to remember that there is a part 2 of this presentation that we're going to do in a few weeks. And it will allow us to send out some strategic priorities for that workshop, because it will be a working workshop. There will not be anyone talking at you. You will be participating in some things that will help you begin to build your toolkit, and they will be surrounded by our English courses that we all assist the English liaison with teaching. We are looking in as the new presentation of making sure that we continue the work that John Teleha has begun so that we can better assess what we're doing consistently. That is so important. I think you all do a wonderful job when you teach those courses or those instruction courses. But now we're taking what he's developed and what he has done with his group and moving it forward so that we are more consistent and can assess and better showcase what we do. So if you will click into the Padlet.
Joni, can you put that in the chat?
I will.
Okay, thanks.
And I think if the reason you're seeing my name show up is because I have a Padlet account. So it's not letting me be anonymous.
And it's okay, John, because you're one of our experts.
But I just wanted people to know why my name can show up and maybe theirs isn't.
All right, a few more minutes. Give us all those ideas. All right, 1 minute. And we will close out the Padlet. Someone had the ideas are endless. It's just ensuring that we align with the proper frameworks. Can anyone expand or add to that?
So yeah, sure. So if we're thinking about instruction or community engagement, if we're talking about some type of initiative, the way that the frameworks are set up is, or the standards, but either way you look at it, whatever we do, we just need to make sure we align with the proper framework or frameworks. So sometimes, as we talked about before, it's not as it's just a step-by-step process. There might be times where it's I think Candace said it earlier, it's iterative. You might start on one framework, head to another, then go back to another framework and skip around a little bit. So if you're doing a class on creating business plans, right? And so the first thing I think of is, when I think of business plans is, of course, you need to research, you need to evaluate, and then also you need to actually present and create the plan, right? So there's probably three or four frameworks going on in that dynamic. So it's just, again, aligning up with whatever you're trying to teach, if it's an actual class instruction, or if it's an engagement initiative. You look at the CEC committee, they have a couple of things that they're trying to do. You think about Welcome Week, you're talking about making sure students have access to information in our library. So that could be, searching is strategic. You know what I mean? So it's just trying to really get to understand the framework and lining it up with whatever we're trying to do.
Thank you, AD. I tried to type that in there. All right, well, I guess we're
You just muted yourself, Joni. Sorry.
Thanks, Stephen. If we don't have, if there is nothing else, we're going to close the Padlet. And what we'd like for you to do, if you have questions, if you would place them in the chat That would be very helpful.
Joni, I have a comment if you don't mind.
Absolutely
When
not.
when we talk about iterative, God, it's hard to say. When we talk about iterative when we're talking about the frames, scholarship as being research and inquiry as being iterative, what we really mean is that we revisit our assumptions, right? And I'll use a dumb example. Most of us are using Microsoft Windows computers, right? And we all say they're Microsoft Windows computers. But if I go back, 10, 15 years, that was a very different Microsoft Windows than what we're using today, right? So scholarship is the same way. You can look at something that is as old as the laws of thermodynamics, which have their roots all the way back with Isaac Newton way back, in the Renaissance, right? But physicists today are constantly looking for exceptions to those rules. They're constantly revisiting those rules. And that's what's led to fields like quantum physics, where Newtonian rules don't exist. They don't work there. So even though those rules have mostly been upheld by the scientific process, they're iterative in the sense that researchers and scholars are always looking to prove things and account for what they observe in the world. And it doesn't matter if they're historians or scientists or whatever, the scholarship process is iterative in that sense, whether it's studying vaccines, whether it's studying sociology, anthropology, any field that you care to think of. That's where the iterative piece of that comes from.
Thank you. Other comments? AD, we can't hear you.
Oh no, I wasn't saying anything. That was my email that caused my
Okay.
yellow sign to pop up. Sorry.
Okay. Other comments?
Well, yeah, just to piggyback off what Steven said, I mean, he took a great real life example, to take a lower end example, I tend to focus on students more, or at least in the past. And, an iterative example for that would be for them to, do a search result, right? And we all know that they don't truly search in the right way. They already have this preconceived idea of what they're looking for. Whereas when you actually start to search and find results, you're not finding exactly what you thought you would find, right? And so then you have to go back and start over if you're truly researching. And that's also a simplistic part that I don't think the students understand here. We all know that a lot of them, not all of them, have a preconceived idea of what they want to write about. So they go to Google or maybe find one article, scholarly article in the database, and whatever is found is what's going to be written, right? Or whatever's actually, sometimes they write it and then they go back and find the citation to
Correct.
try to
Yes.
back it up. So, but ideally, in a sense, we would like for them to, be curious, be explorative, right? A lot of times when you do research, you're finding something new. And a lot of times you have to go back and start over or redirect your thought process or your search strategies. And that's a smaller version of being iterative as well.
Thank you, AD. Others? Other comments, questions?
I think just to piggyback off what everyone else was saying, with research as a strategy or search as a strategy, as you're doing or performing a search, you tend to learn more and more about the actual topic that you're researching. And so that can help you to refine your search. And that's something as a student, you really pay attention to, because you may start off with a preconceived notion about what you're searching for. But then as you read more and more scholarly material about it, you actually get a broader understanding. And so you can actually from there on expand your search terms, and then you can find even more information. And so it actually helps to broaden your perspective about what you're searching for, as opposed to giving you a more narrow-minded view.
Thank you, Candace. Anyone else?
Okay, I know I have missed the presentation, but did you all talk about the difference between a search and research? I'm just curious.
It is in the frames versus the standards, and we did have a few comments about that, but we welcome any comments that you would like to make to add to the conversation.
No, ma'am, I just wanted to make sure we had covered that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I
I
have
was
a
just gonna
question.
say,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Carlos.
I was just gonna say real quick, the, searching as strategic exploration. I worked on a project this past semester where I was creating a LibGuide for leadership in a Black church from like 1800 to 1965, I think. And, you go into that topic with what I already knew, MLK, Southern leadership, what was it, SCLC, and, other leaders that have been highlighted in the Black experience in the South in particular. And it was just a learning experience the entire time, applying some of those strategies. I learned so much new information, things I never learned about in college or in schools through my, K-12 experience. So it is definitely, once you have some of those skills, it really broadens your experience, I think, and make it a true learning experience. It just as search strategies. So, and it made my work at the end of the day that much better. So, I guess my question is, or my challenge would be, I understand the class instruction. You have a brief window to try and nail these frameworks as best we can, in a 50-minute, 45-minute window, and also touch on what services the library has, for these incoming freshmen and sophomore. So it can be challenging to me. And I've seen the people in this room handle that in different ways. And we have done a great job in the past, at letting the students know, of teaching the students how to search and teaching them about what we have here at Bluford. So, I always have that in mind when we're engaging this content. So I'm like, how can I stick to the framework within this 45-minute window and have an impact? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have.
I agree. Great comments, Carlos. We are very blessed to have all of these newly MLS librarians among us and those that are still in school, because we're learning with you.
Can I ask a question, Joni?
Sure.
And it builds right off of what you just said. When I went through library school, there was no instruction related course to take at all. Nothing with pedagogy, nothing with giving you the foundations to be a successful teacher of the library as you went out there. Is there such a course in the current library school framework of your curriculum? Did you actually take a course in that?
Yes, actually, I did, because what I wanted to do was to actually learn how to teach, because I understood from what I'd researched in terms of different library positions that there could be some teaching involved. And so what I did for my elective courses. I actually took education courses about pedagogy and also about teaching reading. And so what that did is it gave me more of a foundation, even in terms of like the NCDPI and how they have their standards, and also how those align with the ACRL, ALA standards and frameworks, and how to teach to different types of learners, and also how to kind of structure the lesson plan. But I found that if you, yeah.
I'm sorry. Harvey, I saw you had a yes in
Oh.
the chat, and Katie had a yes in the chat. Could you speak to your experience as well?
Sure. So in graduate school, I took a course. It was called Lily. It's like library instruction something, but it was a practicum. And in Wisconsin, there is an undergraduate focused library that is designed specifically for undergraduate students. So I had an opportunity to teach there and learn about backwards design. We also discussed the history of library instruction and how it used to be called bibliographic and why we no longer call it that today. And, you know, just the evolution of various literacies, not just information literacies, but there are a range of literacies that we should be equipping our students with. So yeah, I did take a course, and there's LOEX. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with that, but that's a great conference. And it was basically created because what John said, a lot of librarians were not taught how to teach. So there is this conference called LOEX. It's really cool. And they focus on library instruction, and it's nothing but teaching librarians. So if you have an opportunity to go, it's a great place to hang out with teaching librarians.
Thank you. And I see other comments in the chat.
I think it's important to always remember to be relevant. Tell students why whatever you're talking about is relevant to them and their class and their matriculation.
Thank you, Francine. All right, all. If there are no other comments, no other questions, again, if you have questions, please also put those in the chat. I've also put the link for the evaluation in the chat, so please don't forget to evaluate the process this morning. Again, we will send out everything that we had on the Padlet with some very broad instructions for our next part 2 of understanding the ACRL framework. Again, it will be a working workshop in that we will be creating some toolkits, information for you, and working together as a team to go through the frames and to kind of outline some things that we can use when we're working on our English. We're going to take what John Telehai has done. He's done a great job, and move it forward. He's identified some things that we should do for updating it. And so we're going to use that to create your toolbox in a few weeks. AD has another meeting. AD, do you have any closing comments that you would like to make?
Of course, but you don't have to end the session just because I have another meeting. So y'all can keep going and keep pounding. But I do have a quick question.
Sure.
I just want to know, as of right now, if anybody wants to make a comment on what aspects or what frameworks do you see yourself or identifying with right now? You know, if you had to pick one and you find out it was easily to understand, what framework would that be?
I can speak to that. For me, the most obvious has always been research as inquiry, where I teach students that the way to go about selecting a topic for research and choosing the articles that you're going to use to support your idea it's best found and best chosen by asking questions that you want to find an answer to, as opposed to simply trying to prove a point. which is very difficult when it's very difficult to just prove a point rather than it is to find answers to questions.
Thank you, David.
David, I think that's one of the most important ones. But I think I most identify with, the one I mentioned before, searching as strategic exploration, because once I have the concept, that brainstorming process has taken place and I got the tools that I need to go into this search more effectively, that to me is my favorite part, because it's just an explosion of information, useful, I find, information, because the challenge with the students today, this generation today, the search bar has kind of trying to look for a pleasant word to say, but the search bar has, diminished our skills, I would say. And you just plug whatever in that search bar and you expect to find what you need. And it doesn't always work that way. But when you have those right terms, the right language to speak to a database, that's when, you get to rolling with a lot of useful information if done right.
Absolutely. Google Scholar is a tool, not an answer.
Yeah. I think for me, it's scholarship is conversation. That's a simple one, but I get a lot of mileage out of that one because it gives me an opportunity to talk about the conversation. Who is invited to the table to have it? What language are they using? And that goes back to what Carlos is talking about. Our students are brilliant, but they just use different language. They're not using the same language as the database. They're using natural language or language that is specific to their context. So we talk about that. When you're in different spaces, you're gonna talk in a different way. If you're on the yard at homecoming, you're not going to use the same language that you would use in your classroom. So I like to talk about us having the conversation that the field is having, or the discipline. So it's speaking the language of the database. It's empowering the students to contribute to the conversation as knowledge creators. I think that's important, especially at an HBCU. And that's going back to what Francine was talking about, making sure that it's relevant to their daily lives and empowering them to contribute to the conversation. And my last point is scholarship is conversation. As a new librarian, early career professional, it's important for me to think about the conversation, because if there's gaps in the literature, there's an opportunity there to contribute. Just because you don't see something published doesn't mean that your hunch isn't correct, or it doesn't mean that there's no legitimacy or credibility to what you're saying. Maybe there's just certain people having a conversation. So I harp on that for a really long time, even when I talk about the entry of the article. When we look at the article, who is the professor? Where's the professor located? Let's look at the works cited page. Who is this person in conversation with? So
I completely agree with that. Somebody wrote on the Padlet in terms of authority as constructed or contextual, that they become uncomfortable with teaching that peer-reviewed journal articles are the gold standard of authority. And even just in my courses now, I've discovered that there's a lot of points I want to make, but with things that, you write in a scholarly paper, you always have to find other previously performed research to back up your points and what you have to say. And so sometimes that can be really challenging, because there may not be something that specifically speaks to the population you're trying to address or anything like that. And so you have to kind of find ways around it. So it's like, unless you actually have the materials and the capability to actually publish something yourself that gets peer reviewed, sometimes your really valid points can actually become lost.
I wanted to hop in there. I was the person who said that about peer reviewed journal articles. And I think the one about authority being constructed really resonates with me. You know, I think we're supposed to be teaching critical thinking skills to our students. Sorry, I'm really congested. We're supposed to be teaching critical thinking to our students, and just putting information into kind of good and bad boxes does not promote critical thinking at all. You really need to think about you know, what other spaces are people with expertise transmitting information in. It's not just in peer-reviewed journals. There are all sorts of people with amazing credentials who are giving information on TikTok and in Instagram stories about like the pandemic and then all sorts of other topics. So not that I'm suggesting people cite TikTok in their papers necessarily, but it's important to know that there's a lot more out there than just what we've been taught. So, you know, and then there's also the whole issue of bias in the studies that are written about in those journals, who is funding them, what are the biases of the authors and the institutions that are promoting that research. We can't just accept it all at face value. So there's like really a lot to unpack there. So I'm excited to see our profession actually stating that.
Well, and I posted too about authority is constructed and contextual. And of course, I posted a little bit about the DEI perspective, which is something I think our students need to be aware of. But the other thing that I've used in lesson plans and in class sessions that really works is to talk to them about the context, right? So again, to ground it more in the students themselves, I've talked to them about, you know, the weight of reading an Amazon review versus one of their friends recommending something to them, and talking about how, you know, the Amazon reviews can be very untrustworthy because there's known fraud there and there's issues. There's, you know, people being sponsored to write positive reviews, that sort of thing, and how they might take, you know, more of a critical approach when a friend says they liked something or didn't like something, or ordered something that worked really well or didn't work really well. And I think there are ways to take really high concept things from the frames and get them in the spaces where our students and colleagues and peers are thinking in their daily lives, that connects it in a very powerful way.
Thank you, Stephen.
And just to add on, I think, I can't remember who said it, but I think it was about gaps and opportunities. A lot of times we look at, you know, we're looking at the gaps as opportunities, but then also, you know, this comes about the DEI approach in looking at why are there gaps in the first place? Like looking at why in certain spaces are there gaps, right? So yeah, just, I mean, it's a lot to unpack. I love the conversation here, and it can go in many directions. I just think that, in going back to Carlos's question, you know, maybe we just need to, we'll talk about it as a group and we'll move forward, but, you know, trying to scale back as much as possible during those instruction sessions to really highlight what we're wanting to highlight. All right, so, you know, depending on what the goal is and what we want to get out of the class, right, maybe focus on one framework, and, you know, depending on what the class is, maybe focus on one framework and maybe scale back on some of the services we try to promote, you know, without trying to pack everything into a 50 or 75-minute class. So maybe that's kind of the first take, is identify what we want to get the students to learn, and then scale it back and to ensure that we get what we need out of that class, while also making time for assessment as well. So a lot to unpack, lot to do, but great questions and great conversations.
Thank you, AD. Well, we don't want to hold you. I think everyone has said what they've wanted to, and we've got a plethora of information from our chat. And of course, this will be recorded, so we will unpack everything that you've said today. We will have a meeting in the morning with the LLP team to prepare for our next section on information literacy and the framework. Don't touch the frames. So please remember to evaluate this session. We still have time if you'd like to add information in the chat. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out today. I think we had as many as 21 people in the session, so I'm pleased to see that. And I too am very appreciative of the conversation. Remember, we're all learning together. I'm excited to be with this group here at Bluford Library, and everyone's doing a great job. So thank you all. And as soon as we can get the recording cleaned up, we'll definitely send everything back out to you this week. Thanks.